Yeah, thank you, Sandro, and thanks again for inviting me to that great event. It's my pleasure to speak in the second consecutive year here now, providing you perspective on how automotive is changing, especially towards electronics and software, which has a dramatic impact as well on the semiconductor players. And let me also emphasize what Sandro said about the collaboration that we did. Last year we looked together into how the architecture of the car is changing in terms of electronics and software, and what does that mean for different companies. Now we have looked a bit deeper also into the numbers, looking how is the market changing, how are value pools shifting towards electronics and software in the car, what does it mean for an individual car, and we did that together with the GSA, but also with a lot of other experts that we involved through the process to understand the trends, to understand also different pockets of value that we could address, and these are the results that I would like to present you now, and I think they all also fall under the slogan that you had for the executive forum here, which are winds of change. And the automotive industry is indeed going under change that it hasn't seen for the last decades or even the last century. When we talk about automotive and the automotive trends, I think this will be a slide that in any variation you will see today about 10 times, but it's important. We see that there are basically four mutually reinforcing trends impacting the automotive industry, which is autonomous driving, connectivity, electrification, and shared mobility. And they indeed are mutually reinforcing in a sense that one with the other is not really going to happen. For example, autonomous driving will probably have a real breakthrough only when we have also electric cars to have the robo-taxi use case. This will be probably a breakthrough scenario that you will then also see reflected in market figures, because once you have regulation, technology coming together and kind of boosting topics like robo-taxis or also like xEV penetration, you will then see a significant impact on the market. And all of those trends are of course fueled by electronics and software. Autonomous driving in the end is a software product. Yes, it is running on high computing electronics, it is running on sensors, but the real intelligence and the differentiation in autonomous driving will probably happen because of the algorithms that are running on top. Connectivity, well, it's opening up an ecosystem into the automotive world that we only know from the consumer electronics at the moment, and will then of course also dramatically shift the value creation of car, where we today value a car mostly by its powertrain, by its chassis, by its kind of driving power, and will probably in the future value a car by its user experience, its ease of use through connectivity features. Electrification, of course, a completely new market. We see then kind of values shifting away from classical powertrain components, diesel, gasoline, etc., into power electronics, which again is a massive new market. And I just heard yesterday one of my colleagues saying that like in a normal powertrain you have like 4 to 5 different chips. In a power electronics and EV you have like 60 different semiconductor chips. So this is kind of just showing the magnitude of change. And even shared mobility will have an impact on the electronics and software market, because you're moving away from the I want to configure my car with 100 of different options and every car is a bit kind of different, towards can we produce 10,000 cars for a city that are completely the same because they're just built for a purpose to bring people from A to B in a very convenient way, and that again will have an impact on the content of the car. So we are moving away from a state where kind of everything is decentralized, we have single systems, into more of an integrated view of how we see the stack. And this has two kind of significant impacts. On the one side, of course, with the strengthening of central architectures, of central domain controllers, you will have higher performance computing hardware, which of course is also more expensive, and also you will be able to have a higher penetration rate of those components. Secondly, through the separation of layers that we see, we don't have the integrated systems running in each ECU anymore. You will also open up new market dynamics. In the future, OEMs might not kind of buy a fully end-to-end system like an ACC system and an ECU, but might buy from different suppliers a sensor, an ECU or domain controller, an actuator, and then the software on top. by a completely different vendor, maybe doing the integration themselves, doing the testing themselves, and this will of course shift the market dynamics, where you go away from the traditional, there's a tier N to tier 2 to tier 1 to OEM relation, towards a more like open ecosystem where companies work together and kind of shift together values. And the shift of the software architecture also goes along with a shift in the EE architecture. And I think this is a picture hopefully most of you have seen by now, and we try to kind of discuss it further and further, how the industry is running. Today we are in a state where we have still mostly decentralized cars, the ones that are currently being developed, focusing on a domain controller architecture. And of course this will then shift in the electronics content away from single ECU system towards more domain controllers. In the future we might even envision further virtualization of domains, meaning that the electronics content is moving away and there will be more software content to come. But this is a bit like a future outlook. At the moment when we talk about kind of the current architecture of cars, we probably look into this fourth generation of a domain-controlled architecture. Now, everybody was waiting for a few numbers, hopefully. These are kind of how we currently see the market. So the good message to everyone working in the industry of electronics and software, it is growing. Right? And it's basically growing across all components. When you compare it with like the automotive sales growth, which is kind of depending on whom you ask, between 2 to 3% per year until 2030, we see that the total growth of electronics and software content is probably double or even more the size of that growth. And what are the drivers for that growth? So kind of the largest driver in terms of single-digit growth is power electronics, which is of course clear. If we have a shift from ICE cars towards xEVs, then you of course have a significant shift from traditional combustion components towards power electronics. And the figures that you see even exclude batteries. So if you kind of take into account batteries as well, then the growth will be even more massive. And this is interesting because even in this case, in 2030, we expect an xEV sale of around 20% per year. So when you kind of extrapolate that beyond 2030, or even think about more aggressive penetration scenarios of xEVs where there will be more BEVs, HEVs, etc. being sold, this market might kind of even overtake any other market that we have today in the electronics sector. So it's kind of an interesting growth factor. The second driver for growth are software. Software, when you take together the software, the function development, and then also integration and verification validation services, which will be a very important market going forward, you have about 9 to 10% growth in that market. And that just shows kind of the rising importance of software in a car, with more complex systems speaking to one another, with also higher integration efforts to kind of connect software functions, where in today's cars you mostly have like singular functions running on singular ECUs. You need to, for at least level 3 cars, or then even beyond, connect systems, connect sensors to each other, to have a sensor fusion, to have a whole environmental model, connect those into your infotainment system to have certain signals displayed, connect them with your body control as well, for example, for active occupant safety. So with this rising importance of software, this market will be one of the largest growing. And again, this can also be expected to grow further. The interesting thing about software is that you normally have like a lagging effect between the market and then the launch of the product. In the electronics market, you basically design something, put some R&D costs into it, and once the car launches, you can kind of sell your products into the market and gain revenue. With software, as the effort is the R&D, I mean, there are basically no marginal costs associated with software. You all kind of generate your revenues normally like 2, 3 or more years before the start of production, because you put in your effort in the R&D. That's the reason why when we talk, for example, about level 4, level 5 autonomous cars, which will come into the market somewhere in the next decade, the investments of that will already materialize this or the next years. So it's a bit of kind of an early effect. Other electronic components, especially ECUs, DCU sensors, and also like harnesses, controls, switches, displays, are also all growing. That's mostly because of the factor of higher take rates for certain electronics features. More cars will have inbuilt navigation systems, which will drive display sales. More cars will have basic ADAS functions, especially when we look into NCAP requirements. More and more kind of like easy ADAS functions like emergency braking, etc. will be deployed, and they all need sensors, they all need ECUs. The interesting factor at the ECU market, and here we explicitly didn't wrote only electronic control units, but already domain control units, is that of course you have a growth in the market. At the same side, you have a declining effect on the one side because of declining prices for the units, of course, but secondly, through the consolidation of multiple ECUs into one domain controller, you will probably also have lesser single ECUs, and that will again kind of decrease the market, yet the growing effect is still larger. Geographically looking, the largest hotspots, and here we are looking mostly into where the kind of cars are produced, where the components are built in, is Europe and China. And I think that again kind of signifies the importance especially of China, where kind of a major part of the power electronics, and then if you take into account the batteries, it's even further, will be kind of, will have the primary market. And also Europe, through the very important automotive production, will of course be a target market for all that features. Now, I would like to kind of look into the single components a bit deeper before I jump into a kind of a overall conclusion. First, when we apply these different components now on a single vehicle, we see a few interesting effects. And what you see here is basically a comparison between 2025 and 2030 when you look into a content per car at three archetypes that we kept stable. So we have a B segment volume car, level 1, so very basic assistant assistant with an ICE powertrain. You have a C segment robotaxi, which is like purpose-built vehicle, very standard with a BEV engine, and then you have like an E or F segment, so luxury car with an L3 function PHEV, so that would be like the high-class premium vehicle that you maybe get out of Munich or Ingolstadt. And what you see is that when you kind of keep the car stable and the content stable, mostly you have an effect of decreasing kind of content per car, especially in the middle case, and that's mainly because once we kind of get into higher adoption rates of certain functions of sensors, for example, the LiDAR sensor is one of the main driver in the middle case why the kind of content per car is dropping, systems will become more affordable. So the market growth that you've seen before is not due to the factor that in a single vehicle which is equipped the same thing, there will be more electronics and software content, but just that through the affordability of components, there will be more and more cars equipped with certain electronics and software functions. So it's kind of the take rates are the driver, not so much the single content per car. What you also see is that even in 2025, basically the like highly equipped car is basically already at its max. There's very little difference in the very right case between 2025 and 2030, which then also means that a car maker kind of on the long run has to take into account kind of what do I need to put into my material costs of a car and how can I sell it at a then adequate price. Because kind of to, for example, finance the large amount of software that you have in the right case, you of course need to also have a large enough scale of your production, meaning that OEMs might rethink, am I alone kind of large enough to develop software and deploy it into my car, or do you need a larger car park, for example, in alliance with other OEMs to distribute the software costs? And probably we could do a few more of those analyses, and we'll be happy to do that going forward, but I think that these are just showing a very interesting effects. Jumping into the ECU and DCU market, so electronic control units and domain control units. As you saw in one of the earlier charts, we are now kind of at the verge of adoption of domain controllers. First cars with such architectures are launched into the market or just starting into production, and then that will be something that will continue in the next years. And this is also what you then see when you kind of look into the market. You have an overall kind of positive adoption rate and CAGR. but you will have a kind of substitution of electronic control units to domain control units, whereas in 2030, in this base case, you even have about 50% of the market, not anymore in the small distributed electronic control units microcontroller, but more in central domain control units, which then of course also have a different requirement in terms of semiconductors and chips. In terms of domains, it will be mostly infotainment and the autonomous driving domain that will drive this adoption, because here you have like a natural tendency towards going to domain control units in the infotainment case, because it's just easier to provide like the user experience that you would expect on a high performance computer. In the ADAS case, especially when you're talking about L3 or above, there's basically no alternative to a very high computing domain controller. And of course, there's still the discussion going on how much of the intelligence and the pre-processing you could do in the sensor versus the central domain controller. But in the end, it will be mostly domain controllers will kind of drive the market out of these areas. Looking into sensors, and the picture is similar, and I think this is also something that when you go through the through all the market figures and kind of look into sensitivities, you will always see again, there's basically the two large drivers of the market is always autonomous driving and to a lesser extent electrification. And here in the sensor market, it is definitely autonomous driving that is driving the market growth. All other kind of sensor classes may be body sensors, chassis sensors, powertrain sensors are either stagnant, meaning growing exactly at the market rate, or in the case of powertrain are even declining, because in the end the sensor content of a combustion engine is higher than the one of an electric engine. But again, kind of sensors for autonomous driving or safety in general are kind of driving market growth in sensors as well. And you see kind of a bit when you look into the breakdown of the market that it's basically across all sensor classes, cameras, lidars, etc. But kind of the one going from 0 to something is of course the lidar sensor. Whereas interestingly enough, here we don't have the 2025 figures, is that the lidar market in 2025 is probably the same size or roughly the same size than in 2030. Might be 1 billion up or down, which is always a bit difficult to predict into the future. That is not because of the effect of a volume effect. You of course have increasing volumes until 2030, but the price effect and the price decrease, especially for lidar sensors, will be massive because it's a new technology. It's not fully developed yet. At the moment, it's basically not affordable to build in a normal car. So this will kind of overlay then the volume effect even more. Looking into software market. Shouldn't be software and sensor, it's just software. And again here, these are the figures that we have for function development, but then also later integration and validation. You again have the effect that about half of the market we expect to be out of ADAS and HID functions. This is mostly because of algorithm development that you need for level 5, software integration for the different kind of sensors together with then the control units, etc. But you see also that kind of there is a shifting market where certain components will remain mostly stable, like body and chassis functions, a bit of a growth, powertrain functions, a bit of a growth, but kind of very small, while kind of the two largest growth areas are, or three are ADAS functions, energy functions, due to BEVs, and then in the end infotainment. What you also have as a growth, but kind of still overall small market, is the whole question of the autonomous middleware and operating system. When you kind of look from decentralized architectures going into centralized architectures, you will need very strong operating system in the end, a middleware that is combining these domains. An operating system required to really kind of standardize applications that you develop on top. Because if you imagine such a high complex car as we're looking to the future, and you basically have proprietary operating system across all electronic units, you will kind of die out of complexity. So it will be a key kind of requirement for the industry as a whole to think about kind of what is our standard operating system and how can we kind of very efficiently develop applications on top. And I think the battle is still out there if this will be something like an open source approach, or if this will also be commercial solutions that will in the end prevail. But this is a market that in itself is not that large, but will be a key enabler for everything that is running on top. Very quickly into kind of power electronics, and I think this is what I mentioned in the beginning. We are still looking into a scenario in this case where there's not like 50% of cars sold on an xEV platform, but it's 20, and kind of this is mostly because of kind of you have still a lot of production in India, Brazil, etc. You have a long tail of ICE production that is kind of not yet at a EV level, and it's basically two effects that you have. On the one side, of course, power electronics being deployed in these xEV platforms, but on the other side, also for the 91 million produced cars that have an ICE, there will be a lot that will be like mild HEVs, meaning that they have kind of some power electronic support. So there again, you have also a bit of a market growth, and this is basically what you then see growth across all power electronics components. So what are we doing now? Basically, the requirements for companies navigating the automotive industry are very similar, be it a semiconductor, a tier 1 or an OEM. So first, we believe that it's important to kind of really understand the architecture and software implication and basically build up your capabilities to become a part of the early or shaping discussions. We believe that there will be a lot of standards and kind of technologies being set that are not clear yet. So if you are early on in the discussion, you also normally have a better position to also place your capabilities into it. There is no silver bullet, which is very important. I think nobody knows yet kind of what the exact technological solutions for each of those components will be. So there will be also a bit of a kind of experimentation and setting the right bets. Then thinking about yourself, kind of what control points do I have and how can I use them to expand my market penetration will be really key. So kind of what are components, capabilities, maybe also customer access that I can really use in that area that is differentiating towards my competitors or also other new companies going into the market. And lastly, it's nothing a company can achieve alone anymore. Even the largest OEMs that we see don't have sufficient scale, if you do the math, to kind of scale all the costs, for example, for software development across all components. So it will be a game of partnerships and kind of alliances. So we truly believe that there will be even more alliances than today between competitors and across the whole value chain from like tier somewhere towards the OEM. With that, thanks for the attention and looking forward to the ones that join the workshop this afternoon.